Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. It was Labor Day weekend, and I'd decided to camp alone on the eastern side of Lake George in upstate New York. I'd been there before with friends, but this time I wanted quiet. No chatter, no phones, no schedules. Just me, my kayak, and the lake. The eastern shore is less developed than the west side, with stretches of forested shoreline and a handful of primitive campsites you can only reach by boat. That was exactly what I wanted. I left the public launch late in the afternoon, my kayak packed heavy with gear. The lake was calm, sunlight shimmering off the water. I paddled north for what must have been an hour and a half, passing small, rocky islands, quiet coves, and stretches of pine forest that looked untouched. The sound of the paddle dipping in and out of the water was the only thing breaking the silence. Eventually, I spotted a small clearing up a short rise from the shore. Flat ground, a few trees for shade, and just enough room for a tent. It looked perfect. I pulled the kayak up onto the rocks, dragged it far enough up so it wouldn't drift off in the night, and carried my dry bags into the trees. The smell of pine needles and lake water mixed in the air. The sun was dropping low, the sky turning that deep orange color you only get at the end of summer. By the time I had the tent set up, the light was fading fast. I boiled some water for dinner, ate sitting on a fallen log, and listened to the forest settle. In the distance, I could hear loons calling, that long, echoing sound that carries across water. Aside from that, nothing. No boats, no voices, no distant hum of cars. Just the woods and the dark water stretching out in front of me. When night fully came, I climbed into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay there listening. The lake lapped quietly against the rocks. Now and then, I'd hear a small splash, fish breaking the surface or maybe something dropping from the trees. It was peaceful. I remember thinking it was one of the calmest nights I'd ever had outdoors. At some point, I fell asleep. When I woke, it was pitch dark. The kind of darkness where even your own hand in front of your face is just a faint outline. I checked my watch, 3:02 a.m. I didn't know what had woken me until I heard it again. The soft rasp of metal teeth sliding against fabric. A zipper, my tent zipper. It was slow, careful. Someone outside was unzipping it inch by inch. My chest went tight and I couldn't move. The sound stopped halfway, leaving the zipper hanging open maybe 6 inches. Then nothing. I lay perfectly still, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Through the thin nylon, I saw a shadow, a shape crouched just outside. Not moving, just there. I tried to breathe quietly, but even that felt loud. My small knife was in my backpack at my feet, just out of reach. Every part of me screamed not to make a sound, not to move. After what felt like a full minute, I forced myself to whisper something loud enough to sound like a threat, hoping whoever it was would leave. Silence followed. Then came the faint crunch of leaves, the sound of someone backing away, slow, deliberate. I lay there frozen for a long time after that, listening to every creak and rustle outside. Eventually, I heard what might have been a small splash, like a foot slipping near the shoreline. Then quiet again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every time I started to drift, I'd hear some sound and jolt awake. The air felt heavier after that. Colder somehow, though the night had been warm earlier. I kept my flashlight in my hand, ready to swing it at anything that moved. When the first gray light started to filter through the trees, I finally unzipped the tent the rest of the way and stepped outside. The air smelled like damp leaves and cold water. Everything was still. The ground was wet with dew, and the grass around the tent was flattened in places where someone had clearly been walking. My food bag, which I'd hung from a branch a few feet away, was gone. The cord had been untied neatly, not ripped or clawed through. My dry bag, where I'd kept extra clothes and gear, was unbuckled and half open. Nothing major was missing from that, just shifted around. A raccoon couldn't have done that, I knew it. The zipper on the tent had been opened exactly halfway and stopped clean. Whoever it was knew what they were doing. I found the food bag about 30 yards away, near the tree line. The rope was tangled and some of the contents were gone. Jerky, granola, a few other things. I searched around for footprints, but the ground was mostly covered with pine needles and leaves. Few places looked disturbed, but nothing I could really identify. I tried to tell myself it was some hiker who got lost, or maybe someone camping illegally nearby who thought they could steal food. But the way they moved, the way they'd crouched outside my tent without saying anything, it didn't feel random. It felt like someone was waiting for me to react. The rest of the morning was quiet. I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see movement. When the sun rose higher, I forced myself to make coffee, trying to act normal. I stayed there most of the day, walking along the shore, listening for boats. Nothing came by. By evening, I decided to pack up. The idea of spending another night there made my stomach turn. I started gathering my things, breaking down the tent, rolling up the sleeping pad. When I pulled the stakes from the ground, I noticed something near where the zipper side of the tent had been. A small pile of stones, river stones, smooth and round, stacked 3 high, perfectly balanced. They hadn't been there the day before. The sight of them stopped me cold. They weren't big stones, but the way they were placed was deliberate. Someone had taken the time to do that. Maybe while I was asleep, maybe right before they'd walked away. I crouched down and touched them. Cold, damp. I remember thinking about how quiet it had been when I woke up, how whoever it was must have moved silently through the woods after leaving that behind. I finished packing quickly after that. The sun was setting, a deep orange glow reflecting off the lake. I shoved everything into the kayak and pushed off just as the light faded. The water was calm, the surface glassy under the rising moon. I didn't bother turning on my headlamp. I wanted to see everything around me, every shadow, every ripple. As I paddled away from shore, I kept looking back. The little clearing was barely visible through the trees now, but I could still make out the shape of where my tent had been. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. I imagined someone standing there, watching the water, watching me go. The moonlight was bright enough to see across the lake, but every splash of my paddle sounded too loud. The wind picked up slightly, carrying sounds from the forest, branches creaking, leaves rustling, but each one made me twist around, scanning the shore. Halfway across, I stopped paddling and just drifted for a moment. The kayak rocked gently. I listened. Nothing. No engines, no voices, no movement. Just the soft slap of water against the hull. When I reached the western shore, I pulled the kayak up onto the sand and sat there for a long while, breathing hard, even though I hadn't been paddling fast. My arms ached. My eyes burned from staying wide open the whole way across. The next morning, back at the launch, I told a park ranger what had happened. He listened, nodded, and said sometimes people row or kayak out there late at night. Locals, mostly. He said they sometimes get reports of strange activity on the islands and remote campsites. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. Driving home later that day, I kept thinking about that zipper sound. The slow pull, the careful pause halfway. Whoever was out there didn't just want food. They wanted to see me, to watch me wake up. The stack of stones wasn't random. It was a message. Maybe something simple, like a warning. Or maybe just proof that they'd been that close. I haven't gone back to Lake George since. Every time I think about camping alone again, I picture that small clearing under the pines, the cold moonlight on the lake, and the soft, deliberate sound of a zipper sliding open in the dark. My cousin and I decided to hike the McCormick Wilderness in Michigan's Upper Peninsula late one summer. It was one of those places that barely feels like part of the world anymore. Just miles of dense forest, boggy trails, hidden lakes, and no signs or marked campsites. The kind of place that doesn't even have reliable maps. You go in with a compass, a GPS, and the understanding that if something goes wrong, it's all on you. We started out in the morning, the air cool and damp, with fog still sitting in the low spots between the pines. The trails were rough, more like fated game paths than anything official. Our packs were heavy, our boots soaked by midday from stepping through mud and small pools hidden beneath tall grass. It smelled like wet earth and pine needles. We didn't talk much, just focused on keeping a steady pace. The further we went, the quieter it got. No road noise, no planes, just wind and the occasional call of a distant bird. It felt like stepping back 100 years. By late afternoon, after hours of climbing over fallen logs and pushing through thick brush, we found a small unnamed lake on the map. Nothing more than a dark oval surrounded by forest. It was a good enough spot to stop. We dropped our packs, set up the tent on a patch of dry ground a few feet from the water, and got a small fire going. The smoke drifted upward, barely visible through the trees. The place was still, almost unnervingly so. The lake was maybe 100 yards across, ringed with mossy rocks and tall grass. You couldn't see far into the opposite tree line because the light was already fading. When the sun started dipping behind the trees, everything took on that dull gray-blue color that comes just before dark. We ate in silence, too tired to talk much. It felt peaceful, in a lonely sort of way. Then, just as dusk turned into night, I saw a faint glow across the lake. At first, I thought it was the moon reflecting off the water, but it was too steady, too round. It looked like a lantern, or maybe a campfire that wasn't flickering. My cousin noticed it too. It sat just beyond the tree line, a small, steady yellow light unmoving. It struck me as strange. The McCormick Wilderness isn't the kind of place where you bump into other campers. It's remote, really remote. We figured maybe someone else had the same idea. Maybe another group of backpackers had set up across the lake. That thought was oddly comforting at first. It meant we weren't completely alone out there. But the longer we watched it, the stranger it seemed. The light didn't move at all, didn't waver like fire usually does. It was just there, still, as if someone had hung a lantern and left it burning. We went back to tending our fire, trying to ignore it. The woods creaked and popped the way they do when the temperature drops at night. Around 9 or 10, the forest had gone dead silent again. Even the frogs stopped croaking. When I looked back across the water, the light was gone. I figured whoever it was had turned in for the night. We sat by the fire for a while longer, poking at the coals, and just as I was about to crawl into the tent, I saw it again. This time it wasn't across the lake. It was moving slowly around the shoreline. I couldn't see anyone holding it, just the glow bobbing slightly, like something being carried low about waist height. It kept coming closer, following the edge of the water, steady and slow. The sound of insects had stopped again. My cousin noticed it the same time I did. We both froze. I could feel my heart beating in my throat. Without saying anything, we put out our fire. The darkness fell fast, thick and absolute. We crouched down near the tent, watching through the trees. The light stopped maybe 100 yards away, just across a narrow curve of the lake. It didn't move for a long time. I could barely breathe. Then, just like that, it blinked out. Total darkness again. We sat there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting for some sign of movement. Nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, just the distant sound of the wind moving through the trees. Eventually, we climbed into the tent, though neither of us really slept. Every small sound outside, branches creaking, leaves shifting, kept me awake. When dawn finally came, it was gray and quiet, a light mist hanging over the lake. We decided to check it out, half out of curiosity and half to reassure ourselves that there had to be a simple explanation. The walk around the lake took about 15 minutes. The ground was soft and uneven, covered in wet moss and ferns. When we reached the opposite side, we found a small clearing right where we'd seen the light stop. The grass there was flattened in a rough circle, and there was an old broken fire ring, just a few blackened stones and some charred wood that looked years old. Nearby, half buried in the dirt, was a rusted tin lantern. It was cold, covered in a thin layer of dew, the handle bent. It didn't look like it had been lit in a long time. That part hit me harder than I expected. We both just stood there for a minute, not saying anything, trying to make sense of it. There was no tent, no gear, no footprints, nothing. Just that old lantern and the feeling that someone had been there long before us. We packed up camp not long after that. Neither of us said it, but we both wanted to get out early. The woods felt heavier that morning, thicker somehow. It was like the silence had weight. We followed our GPS back the way we'd come, moving faster than before. The trail was barely visible in some spots, but the coordinates kept us on track. About 3 miles into the hike, we came across a tree that neither of us remembered seeing before. It was big, maybe 2 feet across with rough gray bark. Carved into the trunk, about shoulder height, was the number 46. The numbers were deep and clean, the cut still fresh, no weathering, no moss. We stopped and just stared at it. Neither of us had a knife that could carve that deep, and we hadn't seen anyone else out there. The area wasn't part of any marked trail system, and later, when I checked maps online, there was no Trail 46 or anything with that number anywhere near the McCormick Wilderness. We hiked the rest of the way out in silence, both of us scanning the trees more than we wanted to admit. Every once in a while, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that faint glow again through the woods. When we finally reached the trailhead and the car, I felt that strange kind of relief that only comes when you leave the deep woods. It was like stepping back into reality. Roads, cell signal, the low hum of civilization. That night, I looked up everything I could find about old logging camps and survey markers in the McCormick area. Some maps from decades ago showed numbers carved into trees to mark sections for timber crews. The 46 could have been one of those, except those carvings were supposedly done in the early 1900s, 100 years ago. I don't know what we saw out there. Maybe the light was just a reflection, or some trick of the air. Maybe someone had camped there years ago and the lantern was left behind. But the way that light moved, slow and deliberate, and the way it stopped right across from us, it didn't feel like an accident. Sometimes, when I think back to that night, I remember the moment before we killed our fire, the woods around us silent, that glow drifting closer through the trees. I can still see it, steady and pale like something searching for where it once belonged. We never went back to McCormick after that. I had planned the trip for months. A solo weekend in Big Bend, down near the Rio Grande, away from the crowds and the paved loops. The kind of site you needed a backcountry permit and exact GPS coordinates to find. I'd done a few solo trips before, but this one felt different the moment I left the main road. The desert stretched out forever, sand, stone, and thornbush under an endless sky. The air shimmered with heat. Even in the evening when I reached my spot, it was still over 90 degrees. It didn't feel like normal heat either. It was thick, like it clung to your skin and refused to leave. I parked near a dry wash and hiked the rest of the way in with my pack. The Rio Grande was visible in the distance, a thin silver ribbon cutting through the desert. I could hear faint insects, maybe crickets, but the place was mostly silent. No traffic, no human noise, just space and heat. The trail wasn't marked, only faint tire ruts and scattered rocks. The site was just a flat clearing between mesquite shrubs and low desert grass, maybe 50 yards from the riverbank. You could see the cliffs of Mexico across the water, dark shapes under the fading sun. By the time I set up the tent, the sky had turned that deep orange that fades fast into purple. I got the tent staked down tight. The ground was gravelly, hard to drive the stakes into, but I managed. Then I unfolded my camp chair and just sat there for a while, watching the light disappear behind the hills. I remember how still it was. The kind of silence that makes you notice your own heartbeat. When darkness came, the air didn't cool down at all. My thermometer still read 92 degrees. The air felt almost greasy. I drank warm water from my bottle and lay in the tent with my shirt off, sweating against the nylon floor. Even breathing felt thick. Somewhere out in the desert, a night bird called once, then nothing again. Around 11, a wind picked up. It came from the east, sudden and rough, making the tent fabric snap against the poles. At first, it was a relief. Finally, some movement in the air. But with that wind came a smell. It was faint at first, like something sour, then stronger. And within seconds, it filled the tent. I can't describe it perfectly, but it was the worst thing I've ever smelled in my life. Not just rot, something heavier. Like something had died and been left soaking in stagnant water under the sun. It made the back of my throat tighten. I sat up instantly, thinking maybe something had crawled near camp and died. A javelina maybe, or some small animal. But this smell, it felt alive, like it moved with the air. I unzipped the tent window flap and looked out. I had no fire going, just my small lantern set outside on a rock throwing a faint circle of yellow light. Beyond that, everything was pitch black. The smell kept getting stronger, almost to the point of making me gag. Then I heard it crunching. Slow, heavy footsteps moving across the gravel outside the tent. At first I thought it was wind shaking the shrubs, but no. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate. Gravel shifting under weight. It came from the direction of the river, from the east, the same direction the wind came from. My body went cold even in that heat. I froze, listening. The steps moved closer, slow, steady, dragging just slightly between each crunch, like whoever or whatever was walking had something heavy on them. I turned off my lantern so I wouldn't be visible from inside. The tent went dark. My ears strained for every sound. The footsteps circled the tent once. Not fast, not random, just a slow arc around me. My heart was hammering so hard it made the nylon move against my chest. Then they stopped right outside the tent flap. There was breathing. Shallow, uneven, like someone trying to stay quiet but out of breath. I didn't move. I didn't even swallow. I remember the way the fabric of the tent moved slightly in and out from the wind. And every time it puffed in, that smell grew stronger, like whatever was outside was leaking it. Then something brushed against the side of the tent. It wasn't an animal bump. It was soft at first, like fingers dragging slowly across nylon. It started at one corner and moved in a line, slow and deliberate. I could feel the faint movement through the fabric. My mind went blank with fear. I couldn't tell if it was curiosity or testing. Whatever it was, it felt wrong. It moved again, lower this time, across the base of the tent, like a hand feeling the ground. Then nothing. Just the wind. I don't know how long I stayed frozen there, maybe an hour, maybe longer. Every small noise outside made me jump. The smell stayed thick in the air until my eyes watered. Eventually the wind shifted and the smell faded a little, but I didn't dare move. I sat upright the entire night, flashlight in hand, waiting for any sound. Nothing returned, just the faint rush of the river far away. By morning I was stiff and exhausted. When the sun came up, I finally unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The first breath of fresh air felt like relief. The desert was quiet again. No footprints that I could see near the tent, just the scattered gravel. But when I walked about 50 yards toward where the smell had come from, I saw something half buried in the sand near a mesquite bush. It was an old sleeping bag, faded red, torn open down one side. The fabric was sun-bleached and cracked. Around it, the sand had gathered in small drifts, like it had been there a long time. I crouched closer and saw clothes inside. Jeans, a shirt, a pair of hiking boots. All old and stiff, blackened by the sun. No body. No bones that I could see, just the shape of where someone once packed or wore them. The smell was still faint there, like it came and went with the breeze. I backed away slowly. My stomach turned when I realized the way the sleeping bag was placed. It was right along the faint track leading from the river. I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't rest, just tore down the tent, stuffed it in the car, and got back on the dirt road. The drive back to the ranger station felt longer than it had the day before. Every turn looked the same. When I got there, I told one of the rangers what I'd found. He nodded like he'd heard it before. He said sometimes smugglers or migrants use the old river routes and ditch gear when chased, or when they can't carry everything. He said the desert swallows things fast out here. People vanish. Bags, clothes, even cars get buried in sand within months. I nodded, but I couldn't get the smell out of my nose. He didn't say much else, just made a note and thanked me for reporting it. I drove back to my motel that night and unrolled my tent in the bathtub to air it out. The smell was still there, faint but still there. It wasn't the smell of the desert, or of anything alive or dead I'd known before. It clung to the fabric no matter how many times I washed it. For weeks after, even at home, I could catch it sometimes, a hint of that same heavy, wet rot. I'd wake up at night thinking I heard footsteps again, or that faint sound of gravel shifting outside my window. I sold the tent eventually. Didn't want it in the house anymore. But I still think about that night, the heat, the wind, and that thing outside my tent breathing, moving slow, patient, like it knew I was in there but decided to leave. I never went back to Big Bend after that, and every time I think about going somewhere remote again, I remember that smell first. The one that didn't belong to anything living and never really went away. We started the loop trail from the Hoh River Ranger Station early in the morning. The kind of morning that feels damp even before the fog lifts. My girlfriend and I had planned the trip for weeks, a simple 2-night loop, about 20 miles. Total, following the river for the first half before circling back through the dense rainforest. The Hoh is beautiful in a way that feels untouched. Ferns as tall as your shoulders, moss draped over everything, the ground soft under your boots like a sponge. You can walk for an hour without hearing anything but dripping water and your own breath. By mid-morning, the light had turned soft and gray, filtering through layers of green canopy. It was early fall, so the air was cool, heavy with the smell of wet wood and mud. We'd passed only one other pair of hikers near the start, heading out, and after that, it was just us. Around noon, we stopped by a small stream to refill our bottles. While we rested, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, just the faint hiss of the river somewhere off to our right. The silence had a weight to it, like the forest was holding its breath. A few hours later, maybe 6 or 7 miles in, we came across a clearing just off the trail. It looked like a campsite, flat ground, fire pit, and what caught my attention first, a tent already set up. It wasn't old or abandoned looking, not at first glance. A small green dome tent, a folding chair beside it, and a few half-burned logs in the pit. The strangest part was how ordinary everything seemed, like whoever owned it had just stepped away for a few minutes. There was even a pair of brown hiking boots neatly placed outside the tent door, and a metal mug sitting on a rock, half full of dark coffee. We called out a few times, expecting someone to answer from the woods. Nothing. I walked a bit closer, not wanting to be intrusive, but curious. The coffee was cold, a thin film on top. A bag of trail mix was open beside it, damp from the air. The tent flap was zipped closed, but it didn't look weathered or dirty. I couldn't see any name or gear tags, just the typical setup. Sleeping bag inside, small lantern, backpack. My girlfriend said maybe someone went for a hike and would be back soon. That made sense, so we decided to pitch our own tent a few hundred feet away. Far enough for privacy, but close enough to not feel like we were doing something wrong. It was late afternoon, the sun starting to fade, the forest turning dim and blue. We made a small fire, cooked instant noodles, and tried not to think about the silent camp sitting nearby. Every now and then I'd glance in that direction, half expecting to see someone walk out of the trees, but no one did. By nightfall, the forest went black. No moonlight made it through the canopy. I remember lying there, the kind of darkness where even your hand right in front of your face disappears. We could hear water dripping from the branches, and once in a while, a gust of wind would push through the leaves. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember was waking to a sharp sound, something heavy snapping in the woods. I froze. It was close. Not an animal scurrying, something heavier, deliberate. A few seconds later, another snap. Then another, faster, like someone moving through the brush. I turned to my girlfriend. She was already awake, eyes wide in the dim light of my headlamp. Neither of us spoke. The steps came again, crunching through branches, pacing between our tent and the other one. Then a sudden burst of movement, fast, chaotic, and a man's voice shouting. The sound was sharp, high, like someone yelling words but too quick and broken to understand. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine my light outside. Nothing. The beam caught only trees, mist, and falling rain. The footsteps stopped, replaced by silence so complete it felt unnatural. We stayed still for what felt like hours, hearts pounding. Eventually, exhaustion or fear must have pulled me under because I woke again when it was starting to get light. Dawn in the rainforest feels gray, like color doesn't return all at once. The air was cold, heavy with dew. I stepped out carefully, my boots sinking into soft earth. The other camp looked different now. The tent was ripped halfway down this side, the folding chair snapped in two, and the mug was gone. Even the boots were missing. Deep prints, bare footprints, large and uneven, led away from the site into the woods. The prints weren't neat. They looked like someone had stumbled or run. The ground near the fire pit was scuffed up, ash scattered, bits of torn fabric caught in the wet ferns. It didn't look like an animal had done it. It looked like violence, like someone had torn the place apart in a hurry. We didn't talk much while we packed. It was just the two of us, the air heavy with the smell of damp smoke and something faintly metallic. The whole forest felt different that morning. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was sharp, pressing in from every side. Every sound, every rustle made me turn my head. I kept glancing over my shoulder as we hiked out, half expecting to see someone following. We moved fast. The trail was slick, the roots slippery, but we barely stopped to rest. The path back along the river felt longer than before. Once, we found what looked like an old piece of tarp snagged in a bush. Another mile later, I saw something else. An empty instant coffee packet, same brand as the mug at the camp. The forest swallowed everything else. By late afternoon, we reached the trailhead. The parking lot was empty except for our car and a ranger truck. The ranger was leaning against it, writing something in a small notebook. He asked if we'd seen any other hikers out there. I said we'd found a camp with no one in it, described where. He frowned, asked when that was, and then said there hadn't been any registered campers using that loop for over a month. He walked to his truck, pulled out a map, and marked the location I gave him. He didn't say much after that, just told us he'd check it out. I remember how casual his tone was, but something about his face, tight jaw, eyes not meeting ours, stuck with me. We drove away, silent for most of the ride. The farther we got from the woods, the more it felt like something unreal had happened. The smell of wet moss still clung to our clothes, and I couldn't stop thinking about those prints, bare feet in cold mud, leading away into miles of forest where no one had a reason to be. That night, when we reached a small motel in Forks, we showered and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the sound of that man's voice. The way it cracked through the dark, wild and desperate, like he was lost or angry, or both. A few weeks later, I checked the park website out of curiosity. There was a small notice. Trail section temporarily closed due to ongoing investigation. No details, just that. No missing persons reports that I could find. No follow-up articles. Sometimes I still think about that campsite. The boots lined up neatly, the untouched coffee, the quiet that seemed to watch us from the trees. Wonder how long it had been like that before we came along. How many other hikers might have walked past without noticing. The forest keeps things. It covers them, lets them sink into the ground until they're part of it again. And maybe that's what happened out there. Someone disappeared, and the woods just took them back. It was late fall, one of those cold, hollow nights where the air feels thin and sharp enough to slice your breath. I'd been hiking alone for 2 days, following a section of the Appalachian Trail in Western Virginia. The leaves were mostly gone, just brittle scraps clinging to bare branches, and the forest had that lifeless stillness that comes right before winter. I'd set up camp on a small rise overlooking a gully, just far enough off the trail to be out of sight, but close enough that I could find my way back. Easily in the morning, I remember it was colder than I expected that night. The kind of cold that seeps through layers no matter how tight you zip your sleeping bag. I'd built a small fire, boiled water for instant noodles, and then sat there for a long time just listening. Normally, you hear a lot in the woods. Owls, crickets, small things moving through leaves. But that night was different. Too still. The only sound was the wind shifting through dead branches and the occasional creak of a tree. It wasn't silent in a peaceful way. It felt muted, as if something was holding its breath. I went to bed early, maybe around 10. I remember checking my watch because I couldn't believe how quickly the temperature dropped once the fire went out. I zipped myself up inside the tent, pulled the sleeping bag tight, and tried to sleep. It took a while. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been. The popping of cooling rocks from the fire pit, the faint crack of twigs somewhere beyond the tent. But exhaustion eventually won. When I woke up, it was pitch dark, the kind of black that swallows everything. For a second, I thought it was the wind that woke me, but then I realized it was something else. Sound, repetitive, rhythmic. A metallic scrape followed by a dull thud. Over and over, shovel scraping dirt. It took me a few seconds to process it. My mind tried to place it as something else. Maybe an animal digging or branches rubbing, but no. It was unmistakable. The sound of a shovel blade hitting earth, then the soft thump of dirt being tossed aside. It wasn't far either. Maybe 30 yards downhill, I froze. My first instinct was to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe some night hiker setting up a fire pit. But the sound didn't match that. It was too steady, too deliberate. Whoever it was had been at it for a while. I lay there completely still, barely breathing. The sound went on, scraping and thudding, steady as a metronome. My heart was hammering so hard that I could feel it in my throat. I remember counting the seconds between each scrape. Like maybe if I focused on that rhythm, I could think straight. It didn't stop. After a while, maybe 10 minutes. Maybe longer, I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed to see what was happening. I moved slowly, unzipping my sleeping bag inch by inch, then reached for my flashlight but stopped myself before turning it on. Light would give me away. Instead, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek through. The moon was out, low and bright enough to cast faint light through the trees. Everything looked washed out, colorless. The slope below me was patchy with fallen leaves and pale rocks. Then I saw movement. Someone was down there. A person in a dark hoodie bent forward, digging into the earth. The shovel caught the moonlight every time it moved, flashing for a second before dropping back into the dirt. They dig, pause, look around, then keep going. The pauses were the worst part. Every time they stopped, I thought they'd seen me. I could almost hear my heartbeat in my ears. There was no sound from anything else. No birds, no insects, not even the wind now. Just the scrape thud of the shovel. I watched for maybe a minute, long enough to see that whatever they were doing wasn't quick work. The hole was deepening. I could see the rhythm of their body as they lifted and dropped the shovel again and again. My stomach turned over when I saw them drag something closer to the edge of the hole. It was too dark to see what it was, but it wasn't small. That was enough. I couldn't stay there. I didn't think, I just acted. I quietly pulled my pack toward me, shoved my sleeping bag inside without rolling it up, grabbed my headlamp, water, and jacket. I left the tent behind. There was no way to pack it up without making noise, and I didn't care about it anymore. I zipped the tent halfway, trying to keep it quiet, then crouched and started backing away from my camp. Every step felt painfully loud, leaves crackling under my boots. I stopped several times, waiting to hear if the digging had stopped. It hadn't. The sound kept going, steady as ever. When I got far enough that I couldn't hear it clearly, I switched on my headlamp and started hiking fast. Not running, but close. I had 3 miles between me and the nearest Forest Service road, and I wanted all of them behind me as fast as possible. The trail was narrow and uneven, the cold air burning my lungs, and every sound made me flinch. I kept imagining the sound of footsteps behind me, even though I knew it was just my own. It felt like hours before I reached the gravel road. My watch said it was 2:47 a.m. I remember leaning against a signpost, breathing hard, looking back into the trees. Nothing moved, just darkness stretching back into the valley. I walked another half-mile before I found a pull-off where the road widened, and I sat there until sunrise. I didn't sleep, didn't even close my eyes. When the sun finally came up, I started walking again. Around 9, I ran into a park ranger's truck. He pulled over when he saw me on the side of the road. I told him what happened, how I'd camped near the ridge and heard someone digging in the middle of the night. He listened the whole time, quiet, nodding a few times. When I finished, he frowned. He said there had been reports of people illegally digging near old Civil War sites in the area. Artifact hunters looking for bullets, belt buckles, even bones. Some of them did it at night to avoid getting caught. He said that might have been what I heard. That explanation made sense at first. It was better than anything else my mind had imagined. But there was something about his tone that bothered me. Then he asked me exactly where I'd been camping. I described the hill, the gully below, the turnoff from the trail. He went quiet for a few seconds, then said something that made my stomach drop. That area's been closed to the public since last summer. He said it casually, like he assumed I'd missed a sign. But I hadn't seen any closure notices on the trail or anywhere near where I turned off. He went on to say the closure was due to a safety issue. Unstable ground from old dig sites, he said. But the look on his face told me it wasn't just that. He said he'd send a team out to check the spot. Told me to give them any details I remembered. I did, though my memory felt like it was already warping. The trees, the slope, the faint glint of the shovel, it all blended into something unreal. Before I left, he thanked me for reporting it. Said they'd been trying to track people down who'd been breaking into that area for months. I drove home that day and tried to put it out of my head, but that sound, the shovel scraping dirt, stuck with me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it, steady and patient. A week later, I looked up the area online just to see if anything had come of it. There was a short mention in a local paper about park rangers investigating disturbances near a closed section of trail. No details, no follow-up. I don't know who that person was or what they were burying or unearthing, but I still think about the way they stopped every few minutes to look around. The way they moved with a kind of slow care, as if they knew exactly what they were doing and didn't expect anyone to be watching. The trail reopened months later, but I never went back. Still hike, but I stay on marked routes now, close to others, and I don't camp alone anymore. Because once you've heard the sound of someone digging in the middle of the night, in a place where no one's supposed to be, you realize there are some things out there you're better off never seeing. It was early September, cool but not cold, when my friend and I decided to do a weekend canoe trip along the Allagash River in northern Maine. That stretch of the river always had a quiet, untouched feel. Thick pine forest on both sides, long stretches with no sign of people, and water so still in places it looked like polished glass. We'd both done short trips before, but this one was meant to be simple. 2 nights out, 3 days of paddling, camping wherever we found a good spot along the bank. We brought a single canoe, 2 dry bags of gear, a tent, food for the weekend, and a small cooler with beer. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, just enough wind to keep the bugs down. By late afternoon of the first day, we had covered a good distance downstream. The sun was starting to drop behind the trees, the light turning gold, reflecting in wide streaks off the water. We were scanning the shoreline for a decent place to camp. Most of the banks were either too steep or too swampy. Finally, we spotted a clearing, a small flat patch of ground tucked between tall pines maybe 20 yards from the water. Mossy ground, soft and dry. Someone had camped there before. You could tell. A blackened circle of rocks from an old fire. A couple of downed logs someone had rolled into place as benches. We pulled the canoe up, unloaded the gear, and set up camp. The forest around us was quiet. Just the faint sound of running water downstream. The distant call of a loon. I remember thinking how perfect it felt. Cool air, the smell of pine and damp earth. Everything felt still and safe. When I went to gather some firewood, I noticed something strange near the edge of camp. One of the big pines, must have been at least 2 feet thick, had a patch of bark stripped off about 6 feet up. The exposed wood underneath was pale and smooth, almost like someone had sanded it down. The area was too high for an animal to have clawed at, and the smoothness didn't look natural. I ran my hand over it. It felt clean, almost polished. I figured maybe it was from a lightning strike or someone marking the tree with an axe years ago. I didn't think too much of it. That night we built a small fire, cooked freeze-dried meals, and sat around until about 10. The air got cold fast once the sun was gone. When I finally crawled into the tent, everything felt perfectly normal. I remember drifting off to the sound of the fire crackling and the faint lapping of water against the shore. Sometime during the night, I woke up. I don't know what time it was, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, but the fire was out and everything was silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. I could see a faint outline of the trees against the sky. I lay there listening for a while, then fell back asleep. The next day was calm and bright. We had coffee and oatmeal by the fire, packed up a few things, and spent the day paddling further downstream. The water was gentle, and we passed a few beaver lodges and a couple of moose tracks in the mud. We didn't see another person the entire day. By evening, we decided to camp again near the same stretch, only a little further downriver, maybe a quarter mile from the first site. It was another nice clearing. Same type of trees, same mossy ground. After dinner, we sat watching the water. It was one of those perfectly still nights. No breeze at all. The river like black glass. When I looked upriver, I could just barely make out the shape of that first camp through the trees. It wasn't far at all. The only sounds were the quiet creak of branches and the occasional plop of something dropping into the water. We turned in around 11. I fell asleep quickly, dead tired from paddling all day. At some point later, I woke up again. It was pitch black. I remember the air felt heavier than before, damp and cold. Then I heard a sharp crack. It wasn't close, but it was clear, a single loud crack like a branch breaking. Then after a few seconds, another one. The sound echoed slightly off the water. I unzipped my sleeping bag and sat up, listening hard. Then came a dull thud. I reached for my flashlight and stepped outside the tent. The night was still. The air smelled like wet pine and smoke from our fire that had died down to embers. When I shined the light toward the trees, I saw it. The big pine, the one with the stripped bark from the first night. It was shaking. Just slightly, but enough that the movement caught the beam of the light. I froze, staring. The tree wasn't moving from wind, it was a calm night. It was like something had hit it or was still hitting it. The branches quivered, a few needles drifting down through the beam of the flashlight. Then I heard another crack, sharper this time, followed by a loud splintering sound. Before I could even process what was happening, a massive limb came crashing down. It hit the ground with a heavy thud, close enough that I felt the vibration under my feet. The sound was huge, wood cracking, dirt scattering. It missed the tent by maybe a foot. The smell of fresh pine and sap filled the air instantly. Everything after that happened fast. I yelled for my friend to get up. He scrambled out of the tent, wide-eyed, looking around in the dark. I didn't even say anything. We both started grabbing gear and throwing it back into the canoe. The whole time, I kept glancing across the river, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. Just darkness and stillness. We didn't bother to take down the tent properly. We shoved what we could into bags and pushed the canoe back into the water. The silence after that crash felt heavier than anything. We paddled maybe 5 minutes downstream before pulling up on the opposite bank. We didn't even bother to make a fire that night, just lay out our sleeping bags on the ground and waited for daylight. Neither of us slept much. Every small sound made me jump. The splash of a fish, a creak in the trees. I kept glancing back upriver where that tree had stood, half expecting another sound or a light, but the night stayed dead quiet. When the first light came, a pale gray glow over the trees, we paddled back up to the original site. The fog hung low over the river and everything felt damp. The air smelled strongly of sap and fresh wood. When we pulled the canoe onto shore, I saw the broken branch, a thick limb maybe 6 inches around, lying half buried in the moss. The tree itself looked even stranger in daylight. The exposed area where the bark had been stripped now had something new. A cluster of small circular holes punched into the pale wood. I leaned closer. They weren't bug holes. They were too round, too uniform. The edges were splintered inward, and some had tiny streaks of dark metal along the rim. It took me a second to realize what I was looking at. Bullet holes. There were 3 of them, all grouped close together, right at head height. Fresh, too. Bright wood, no weathering, no sap drying around the edges yet. Whoever had fired those shots had done it recently. I turned to look across the river. On the far bank, the trees were thick, a narrow strip of open ground near the water. If someone had been there, they would have had a clear line of sight straight to our camp, straight to the tent. I just stood there staring at that line of trees, thinking about the sound from the night before, the sharp cracks, the thud of the limb hitting the ground. It wasn't wind or an animal. Someone had been shooting in the dark. Whether they were aiming at the tree or at us, I had no idea. But the way those bullets lined up, it felt deliberate. We didn't stick around long. We packed everything up properly that morning, loaded the canoe, and got back on the water without even stopping for breakfast. The air stayed cold and still, and neither of us said much as we paddled. Every now and then I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing on that bank, watching. There was nothing, just the endless line of pines fading into the fog. When we finally reached the next ranger station later that afternoon, we mentioned what we'd found. The ranger didn't say much, just frowned and wrote something in a small notebook. He said there had been reports of people target shooting along that section of the river, even though it was illegal. He didn't look surprised. He said it wasn't the first time someone had found bullet marks in trees near campsites. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't, because those shots hadn't sounded distant. They'd sounded close. I still think about that night sometimes. The sound of the tree shaking, the limb crashing down, the holes in the wood. Maybe someone was just drunk, firing across the river without realizing we were there. Maybe it was just bad luck, but the fact that the shots were so clean, so neatly grouped together, right at the level of our tent, it didn't feel random. We never went back to that stretch of the Allagash again. And every time I hear a branch snap in the woods now, that same cold feeling runs through me. Because for a few seconds that night, out there in the dark, I think someone was aiming straight at us. I'd been on the road for about a week, slowly winding my way through the Dakotas, heading toward Wyoming with no real plan other than to drive, camp, and be alone for a while. I'd been sleeping in the back of my SUV most nights, or pitching my tent near trailheads when the weather was decent. That evening, I decided to stop somewhere in the Black Hills National Forest, somewhere west of Hill City. I'd read that dispersed camping was allowed if you were far enough off the main roads, half a mile or so, and I figured I could find a quiet place before dark. The air had that clean, piney smell that always hits after a stretch of dry weather. It was mid-September, right when the aspens start turning. The hillsides were streaked with gold and yellow against the dark green pines, and the temperature was just cool enough to keep the bugs away. The light had that late afternoon glow, long shadows, a sharp drop in warmth as the sun slid behind the ridges. I drove down a gravel road that seemed to go on forever. No traffic in either direction, just dust rising in the rearview mirror, and the occasional glimpse of deer flashing through the trees. When I finally found a small pull-off, I parked, grabbed my pack, and started walking downhill along what looked like an old logging track. The forest was quiet, except for the wind moving through the upper branches. No voices, no cars, no planes overhead, just silence. About 20 minutes in, I found a flat stretch beside a dry creek bed. It was perfect. The ground was covered in soft needles and small stones, and the creek bed itself was full of smooth, pale rocks that had probably seen water not too long ago. I dropped my pack, stretched out my legs, and set up camp. The tent went up easily. I gathered some deadfall from the edges of the clearing, enough to build a small fire for warmth and cooking. I set my little stove on a flattish rock and boiled some water for rice and beans. By the time the first stars showed, the forest had gone completely still. No distant traffic, no planes, no wind. Just the faint crackle of my fire and the occasional caw of a crow echoing from somewhere deeper in the woods. It was one of those rare nights when the quiet feels total, like sound itself has thinned out. The stars were sharp and endless above me. The Milky Way stretched from ridge to ridge. I remember thinking it was one of the most peaceful camps I'd ever had. Then I saw it. Through the trees, maybe a quarter mile away, was another light. A fire. It was faint at first, just a small, warm glow through the pines. But after a minute, I realized it was larger than I'd thought. It was right at the bottom of the slope where the land dipped into the creek bed, maybe close to where the stream picked up again farther east. I hadn't seen anyone on the way in. Not a single person. No cars parked along the road. So that light caught me off guard. At first, I felt a bit of comfort knowing someone else was nearby. The Black Hills can feel huge and empty when you're alone, and having another camper around made the forest seem less vast. But after watching the fire for a while, something started to feel off. The light didn't burn steady. It flared up bright, then dimmed, then flared again. Too rhythmic, like someone was throwing something on it every few seconds. Not like adding wood either. It had that strange flicker of movement, like something was being fed into it piece by piece. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone burning damp logs or trash. But it stayed on my mind even after I crawled into my tent. I zipped the flap, turned off my headlamp, and listened to the faint crackling of my own fire outside until it went quiet. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first, just that feeling that something changed. The forest had gone silent again, but it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. It was heavier, pressed close around the tent. Then I heard it. Movement outside. Slow and careful. The kind of sound that only happens when something tries not to make any. Brush rustled, then stopped. Another few seconds. A faint crack like a branch underfoot. I sat up, heart pounding, staring at the shadow of the tent wall. There was no moon, just the faint outline of trees above through the mesh. I strained to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. A shuffle, then a drag like someone stepping and pausing, moving around the camp. I held my breath. The air in the tent felt thick. Then came the sound that still sticks with me, a low hiss. Long drawn out. Not quite human, not animal either. It was like a whisper stretched too long. Just breath through teeth about 20 feet away. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a few seconds. I kept waiting for it to come again. Nothing, just dead silence. Then through the trees I saw it, the glow of that other fire. It was still burning faintly, just a warm orange shimmer between the trunks. I blinked, and in that instant it went out, like someone had dropped a blanket over it. 1 second there, the next gone. The forest stayed dark the rest of the night. I didn't sleep again. I sat upright in my sleeping bag with my hand wrapped around the handle of my hatchet, listening to every sound until the sky turned gray. When dawn finally came, the woods looked normal again, peaceful, bright, harmless. I unzipped the tent, stepped out, and took a deep breath. My fire pit was cold. No prints, no tracks, just the same quiet as before. But I couldn't stop thinking about that other fire. I decided to check it out before packing up. I followed the creek bed downhill, crunching over the dry stones until I found the spot. There was a fire ring, blackened rocks, half-burned logs, but something was wrong. Laying across the top was a green pine branch, freshly cut, sap still bleeding from the end. No one uses green wood for fire. It doesn't burn. Scattered around were dozens of small feathers, pale brown and gray, like from a grouse or a chicken. They were mixed in the ash, caught on twigs pressed into the dirt. A piece of rope hung from a branch nearby, tied neatly with a loop, swinging slightly in the breeze. The end had been cut clean. There were no footprints. No gear, no campsite. Just that strange, half-burned ring and those feathers. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. The air smelled faintly like smoke, though the fire had gone out hours before. A crow called once somewhere far off, and the sound echoed weirdly through the trees. When I got back to my camp, I froze. My own fire pit had been covered over. The rocks were gone, and where the ashes had been, there was now a neat pile of dirt. It looked like someone had scooped earth from the creek bed and carefully smoothed it out over the pit, erasing it completely. That was enough for me. I broke camp fast, not even bothering to make breakfast. Every sound on the hike out felt louder. The crunch of gravel, the wind brushing the trees, the echo of my own steps. When I finally reached the gravel road, I felt a weird relief being back near the car. I started driving out, and about 2 miles down, I saw a Forest Service truck parked by the edge of the road. A ranger leaned against the hood, writing something on a clipboard. I pulled over and told him what I'd seen. He listened with a sort of distracted look, then said it might have been poachers, people using fires at night to lure turkeys. He said they'd had reports of that kind of thing in the area before. It made sense in a practical way, and I nodded along, but something about it didn't sit right. Before I drove off, he added almost offhandedly, "Funny thing though, we haven't seen anyone out here for weeks. Just the fires." That stuck in my head all the way back to the highway. When I looked in the rearview mirror one last time, I saw it, thin smoke rising up from the ridge where I'd camped, right where my tent had been. Just a faint gray column against the trees. I don't know if it was another fire or the same one somehow rekindled, but it looked too deliberate to be an accident. I didn't stop. I didn't take a picture. I just kept driving until the trees thinned and the cell service came back. That was the last time I ever camped alone. It was late July, somewhere between Buena Vista and Leadville, Colorado. I'd parked my Subaru off County Road 390, that winding gravel road that splits off from Highway 24 and leads toward all those old ghost towns. Winfield, Vicksburg, Clear Creek. I'd been up that way before, once with friends, but this time I wanted to go alone. I was 28, and I'd gotten into this habit of solo camping trips. It made me feel quiet inside, like I could finally hear myself think after weeks of noise and screens and work. I parked just past a narrow pull-off that looked out toward a stretch of pines and aspen. The air was warm but thin, the kind of mountain warmth that still holds a chill in the shade. The odometer clicked and the sound felt final in that silence. I grabbed my pack, filled mostly with the basics: tent, sleeping bag, small gas stove, water filter, headlamp, a change of clothes, and a can of bear spray that I'd never actually had to use. I followed a faint path through the trees, tracing an old mining road that had half disappeared into tall grass and wildflowers. The sun was still high, and light scattered through the aspens in broken patterns. You could smell the dust rising off the trail, mixed with pine sap and that dry sweetness that always comes before sunset in the mountains. After about 2 miles, I came to a stream cutting through the forest. The water was cold, fast, and clear. A few old timbers lay across it, rotting from age, probably remnants from some mining setup long gone. I decided to set up camp nearby on a flat spot about 50 yards from the stream, where the ground was soft and lined with fallen needles. There were no other camps around, at least none I could see or hear. I hadn't seen another car on the way in either. Just silence and the occasional clatter of stones tumbling from the hillsides. I pitched my tent facing the stream so I could listen to it at night. When I was done, I boiled water, made some instant noodles, and sat on a rock watching the light fade behind the ridge. The air cooled quickly, dropping from warm to cold in minutes. By the time I climbed into my sleeping bag, the forest had gone completely still. The sound of the stream was steady, distant enough to be calming, but close enough to fill the silence. I remember thinking it might be one of the quietest places I'd ever been. At some point, I must have fallen asleep hard. I remember waking suddenly to total darkness, the kind where even the inside of your tent feels like a closed room. My watch said 12:08 a.m. I didn't know what woke me at first, then I heard it, sharp, clear, and echoing across the ravine below my camp. A scream, a woman's voice. It wasn't faint or far away. It carried across the trees like something ripped out of the night. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, then stopped. The sound seemed to bounce between the slopes before dying out. My first thought was mountain lion. I'd read they could sound like a woman screaming when they were mating or fighting. I told myself that's what it was. I stayed still, holding my breath, waiting for it again. Then it came a second time, louder, closer. This time it wasn't just a scream, it was words. "Help! Please!" The sound made every hair on my body stand up. I sat up fast, fumbling for my headlamp, and unzipped the tent just enough to stick my head out. The night was empty, black beyond the reach of the small beam of light. I pointed it toward the direction of the sound, down the slope where the trees thickened near the ravine. Nothing moved. The air was cold now, maybe in the low 40s. My breath came out in a shaky mist. Then suddenly, another sound. A man's voice shouting something I couldn't make out. It wasn't close enough to understand, just rough and low, like anger. Then nothing, just the wind sliding through the trees. I stayed half-crouched at the tent door, trying to decide if I should go toward it or not. Every instinct said not to. I told myself it was probably drunks from the ghost town down the trail, maybe people camping near the old cabins, fighting or fooling around. The sound carried weird in these valleys. It could have been miles away, but it hadn't felt that far. 5 minutes passed, maybe longer. I stood there with the headlamp shaking in my hand, scanning the dark tree line. The forest was still again. No voices, no footsteps, just the steady rush of the stream in the background. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Finally, I zipped the tent back up, laid down, and tried to convince myself it was over. I didn't really sleep after that, just drifted in and out, every small sound pulling me awake. When the first light started to seep through the tent, pale gray and cold, I got up fast. The forest looked normal again. Dew on the grass, mist rising off the stream. But I couldn't stop thinking about the screams. Curiosity or maybe guilt pushed me to check it out before leaving. I packed up my gear quickly, stuffed everything in the pack, and walked toward where the sound had come from. The ground sloped down sharply into a narrow ravine lined with willows and loose rock. I could see where someone or something had moved through. Grass was trampled, branches bent low. I followed it maybe 30 yards before stopping. The air smelled damp and earthy. That's when I saw it. Small dark spots on the rocks, spaced unevenly. At first I thought it was mud, but when I got closer I realized it was blood. Not much, just drops. Maybe a smear on one stone like something had brushed against it. It led deeper down into the gulch, toward where the stream widened into a shaded pool. I stood there staring at it for a long time. Part of me wanted to follow it, to see what happened. But I couldn't make myself do it. The silence down there felt wrong, too heavy. The same stillness I'd loved the night before now felt like something holding its breath. I backed away slowly, retraced my steps, and hiked straight out to my car. It felt like the longest hike of my life. Every crack of a branch made me turn around. When I finally reached the Subaru, I tossed my pack inside without even changing out of my boots. I drove the gravel road back toward Highway 24, checking the rearview mirror over and over. That afternoon I stopped at a small diner near Buena Vista to eat and calm down. The waitress asked if I was camping and I said yes, but didn't tell her where. I thought about mentioning what I'd heard, but it felt strange to say it out loud, like I didn't even know if it had been real. The screams, the voice, the blood, it all felt distant already, like a bad dream that fades the moment you start trying to describe it. I told myself I'd call the sheriff's office when I got home, but I didn't. I just wanted to forget it. I didn't camp again for a while after that. About a week later, I was scrolling through local news online, and a headline caught my eye. Missing hiker found deceased near Clear Creek drainage. The article was short, maybe 6 sentences total. A 34-year-old woman from Denver had gone missing while hiking near an old mining site off County Road 390. Her remains had been found by search crews several days later. No further details released pending investigation. I read it twice, then just sat staring at the screen. The location was almost exactly where I'd been. Same drainage, same area. There was no mention of how she died, just that she'd last been seen hiking alone the weekend before, around the same time I was there. For days after, I kept replaying that night in my head. The scream, the voice, the silence after. I started wondering if I'd really heard a man at all, or if it was just my imagination, trying to fill the space between those screams. I wondered what would have happened if I had followed those drops of blood. Maybe I could have helped her. Or maybe I would have ended up another name in a small article with no details. It's been over 2 years now, and I still haven't gone back to that area. Sometimes when I drive through the mountains and see the aspens flickering in the wind, I think about how quiet it was that night before the screaming started, how safe it had felt. I've camped since then, but never that deep in again. Never where the nearest help is 10 miles of dirt road away. Every now and then, late at night, if I'm lying awake in my apartment and hear someone shout in the distance, some random sound from the street below, it hits the same nerve. That same sound of panic that doesn't belong in the middle of silence. Even though I know I'm far from that ravine, I still feel the same cold rush down my spine that I felt standing outside that tent, light shaking in my hand, waiting for something in the dark to move.